Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Alternative Provision. And this is our first evidence session. We are this morning recording this session, but it's not being live streamed. But just to be aware that we are recording the session. We have four excellent speakers this morning who will be answering questions that you can ask. And the first thing that I'd like to invite you to do is place any questions that you have as we go through the session into the chat box. We will do our best to get through as many of the questions as we possibly can. The purpose of the All-Party Parliamentary Group is to inform and update members of Parliament, both in the Commons and the Lords, on issues that relate to alternative provision. And we set out a couple of months back our programme for the year ahead, and this is the first session this morning. What are the components of good quality alternative provision? We're trying to define quality today, and to help us do that, we have four really excellent speakers, and I'm going to ask them to just say a little bit about themselves. It's customary for me to rabble on about what they do and what they've achieved. I'm not going to do that. I'm just simply going to introduce them and let them talk for a little bit, and then we'll put some questions to them. I'm going to start with Martin Vickers, MBE, who is from Olive Academies.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, Andy. Good morning, colleagues. Thanks very much for the opportunity this morning to be part of the panel to talk to the group. My current role is I'm CEO of Olive Academies, which is an AP and SEND alternative provision MAT. It operates in the east of England and the northeast London region. We currently operate 3 academies, and we're just in the process of transferring to the new academies into our MAT. I also operate as my role as chair of the National CEO Network for AP and SEND MAT leaders. I'm fortunate enough to sit on the DfE stakeholder group for alternative provision, and my interest in alternative provision really stems from my work in mainstream education, where I became head teacher of a secondary school in the south of England. We did a lot of work supporting a PRU, which was close to us, and it really awakened my interest in the role that AP could play in defining a continuum of provision and supporting young people who are at the most need. So I'm really pleased to be here today to give those reflections.
Thank you, Mark. How many students do you have in your academies?
So the largest is just over 100, and the smallest is 50.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Second speaker is Deborah Barnett, and Deborah is from Transforming Lives for Good.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. So I'm the education policy lead at the children's charity Transforming Lives for Good, and that's commonly known as TLG. And I was a former head teacher of one of our alternative provisions in West London. Prior to that, I worked in mainstream for over 15 years, primarily pastorally as a leader. And so with that, I have a broad interest in social justice in education, specifically around exclusion, inclusion, and then a real passion to see, I guess, justice translated in alternative provision. And it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And I think, Deborah, we should note your achievements in that TLG West London was nominated as the Alternative Provision of the Year Academy in 2019. A fantastic achievement. What did you do to get that nomination?
Wow, I think it's just trying to bring that quality to support vulnerable young people in a way that was holistic, and that will bring the transformation in their lives in order that they're able to go back and reintegrate into mainstream education.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Say Patel is from Learn Sheffield.
Good morning, and thank you again for the invitation. So Learn Sheffield is a not-for-profit company which is jointly owned by schools and the local authority and has responsibility for improving education in the city. My background is secondary headship. I was one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and I've also done work for the DfE. In the pre-pandemic time, the 1920 academic year, Learn Sheffield was commissioned by the local authority to look at the quality of alternative provision across the city. And Sheffield's relatively unique in that, with the exception of the pupil referral unit, Sheffield Inclusion Centre, all alternative provision is unregistered in Sheffield. So there are around 20 providers there, and I've certainly been to them all, and as part of the quality assurance, we also did a citywide review, which was carried out in December 2019 and involved a range of stakeholders to look at what could be, what the quality of AP was across the city and what could be done in the future. So that's the part that I have in AP, and thank you again for the invitation today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of the things that you found from your reviews in just a second. My final panelist this morning is Shirley, who is a parent and governor in Chester. Shirley, good morning.
Good morning. Firstly, I just want to say how excited I am by the support and interest for alternative provision. It's changing lives. It certainly changed our family's lives and my son's future. I feel very passionately about this subject. When you're a parent of a child who makes some very bad decisions and who's theoretically very bright, you are suddenly alone. And I can still feel the emotions, and it's quite a few years on. As you can tell, I'm not exactly a young parent now. It's seven, 8 years ago. Your world comes crashing down. You're full of shame and guilt, and you think, where did we go wrong? And how are we going to fix this? And you've got this completely disconnected, very angry young man. A lovely person comes round from the council and says, well, these are the options. And you think, oh gosh, you know, is this where we're going? Because I, like many, had a terrible view of AP. It couldn't have been further from the truth. We were very well supported, an amazing, inspirational place even then, with dreadful buildings, but fabulous staff. And I will be eternally grateful. And very quickly, I was asked if I would be a parent governor because I wanted to support them. And I've done that for quite a few years, but moved in and out of roles, been a community governor and then back to parent governor, because most parents of children in alternative provision do not want to be particularly involved. That might be because of the situation or their social background or their view of alternative provision. And I hope we can change some of that. But it's absolutely key, because investment at this stage in young people's lives saves money and just changes their lives. You know, if you put money in early, you will see the rewards. And this is why this morning is so important.
Thank you, Shirley. I think it's probably worth saying it's the bridge in Chester,
yes,
the AP that you're involved in. You said there that you had, before you became involved, before your son was involved with the AP, you had a view of AP. What was that view?
Well, I was involved in education. I used to work in a local high school. I was a trained counsellor, and I just wanted to go and help young people, really. So for a couple of years, I worked with small groups of 4 who couldn't be in class. And most of the time we succeeded to keep them in mainstream. And I felt really positive about making a difference with those young people and trying to help them make the right choices for themselves. But I say the view because I felt I'd failed if anybody was permanently excluded that I worked with. So I think that sense of failure was, oh, you know, what's going to happen now? There were some very good places that weren't strictly AP that some of our children went to, practical places, learning how to bricks and plumbing and things like that. But this is going back 15 years. And there was a lot more funding available. There was more funding for TAs in the classroom in mainstream. There was more funding for a more diverse, I think there was more funding then than there has been in the last 10 years, for finding different solutions to engage young people and make them feel better about themselves. Anyway, sorry.
No.
My hobby horse now.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting perspective, and I think you know, so often we hear from professionals that are looking at it as people working in the sector, and it's so important to hear from parents, from people that are coming to it from a very different angle. So it's really good that you're here this morning, and your input is really welcome today. I'd like to start by I think probably just exploring what the components are of good quality alternative provision. And we'll come to Mark first, but if you do want to ask a question as we go through this this session this morning, please pop it into the chat and we'll do our best to come to those questions. If it's a general question or if it's specifically to somebody that says something this morning, please just mark that down as well and we'll try and come to that. But Mark, if I can start with you, what in your experience are the components of good quality alternative provision?
Thanks, Andy. And my sort of starts my answer really builds on my colleagues on the panel's kind of passion for high quality sort of alternative provision, because clearly, you know, what I believe in is that our colleagues need to be really highly professional with really high expectations for all young people and have a good sense of understanding, you know, our role within the continuum of provision. You'll hear me talking about that continuum model throughout the hour, really, because for me, good alternative provision in terms of high quality and if its effectiveness is around understanding that it has to work in partnership with others. It can't be working in isolation. It needs to know what it's about and it needs to be connected with others. And then those young people can move along that continuum of inclusive need depending on their need, and the quality of each part needs to be at the highest order, really. So for me, the alternative provision element of that continuum model needs to be really flexible and personalised and child-centred. You need to get underneath the skin of children's story and understand, you know, what it is that's brought them to us, what those barriers might be, the things that they're experiencing and what their strengths are, really, the things that are working well, and build on the things that are working well. The challenge is to engage the hardest to engage, and that's our work, isn't it? That's what we do. And the outcomes that we try to achieve have to be at the highest order, but need to be driven by the needs of the pupils. You know, we need to understand that we've got good pathways in place that we can re-engage and help these young people really quickly to feel some success and build on their self-esteem, because clearly for many that will have really taken a hit before they come to us. So it's about good connectivity between the provision and the schools to get the information and services, so we know what it is we need to be doing as quickly as possible, and then start to think quickly about the needs of that young person so we can start to build some transition plans and pathways which will effectively help to meet their needs and help them to thrive.
Mark, you said about getting under the skin of people that are coming in. How do you do that? I mean, often when children are coming into AP, they've gone through some form of trauma, some things happen that's led them to get that. How do you really get under their skin and understand what's happening in their world?
Well, some of that is about finding as much opportunity as possible to talk to them very, very quickly. So those induction programs, the work before those young people come into us has to be really well planned and really high quality. And I think really that continuum model fits well with that notion, because if we've got good connectivity with our schools, our partner schools and our services, we can start to get that information very, very quickly. And in fact, you'll hear me talk later about, I'm sure, about preventative work, because the sooner we can start to understand the needs of those young people, the sooner we can start to meet those needs and address them and start to get, as I said, under the skin and start to build those relationships. And interestingly, through the pandemic, there's been I think a real positive that's come from that is finding different ways to do exactly that and get under the skin of those young people by talking to them in different ways, using different models and sort of mediums, if you like, to find out more about them, what makes them tick and what their needs are, really.
Excellent, thank you. Deborah, if I can come to you, what do you think are the good components of quality AP?
Sorry, on mute there. My initial response to this would be, imagine it was your child who had reached crisis point and was placed in alternative provision. And I know, Shirley, you can probably really relate to this. So, you know, what would be your biggest concerns? Perhaps their future prospects, academic rigor, isolation, maybe the social exclusion, their emotional support needs, amongst other things. And it is fair to say that running a high quality AP is a challenge with so many needs and concerns to meet, both educationally and pastorally. And I love that notion that my colleague mentioned earlier on about getting under their skin is so important. And that's really about journeying with the young people, getting inside their head. What are you thinking? What are you processing? What happened to you last night? What happened last week? It's talking to them about every facet of their lives to really understand what they're bringing into the setting in order that you could really go ahead and sort of help them. And from TLG's 21 years experience in the AP sector and my personal experience as a former head teacher, I think we believe the fundamental components of a good quality AP include a trauma responsive environment and a strong restorative justice approach, making sure that we're guiding and supporting young people to acquire the essential social and and emotional skills they need. Secondly, an innovative and aspirational curriculum, quality and diverse staffing. And lastly, excellent communication and liaison between providers. And I believe these to be the components that are necessary in providing a good quality AP that meets the needs of our young people. But also these are components that are important in mainstream education as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. Say, if I can move to you from you know, from the work that you're doing and the schools that you've been into, what would you say is sort of the key elements of quality AP?
Yeah, I think obviously all of the above, as has already been mentioned, but I think also it's important to not forget some of the things that we assume would be happening, and we have to, if those things are done well, then you know, that will support the good quality agenda. So we've talked a little bit about communication and sort of engagement, and I'm going to split that into two things. So that's the baseline, the reasons for the AP, what's the history of that student, that information flow from the from the school about why is that student needing this particular support, and then the ongoing communication. I think it's, again, it's perhaps stating the obvious, but it's having a focus on reintegration. What's the end point of this? What's the outcome? When does this stop? And from a Sheffield context, I think one of the things that's important is that all providers have a good understanding on all aspects of the quality of education. So self-evaluation, quality assurance, a well-structured study programme, the support that's required, tracking, monitoring, etc.
Thank you. Shirley, if I can come to you as a mum, as a parent, what did you see in the bridge that made you feel it was the right place for your son, and what did you see that you thought, yeah, this is really good?
I saw a lot that was really good, but it was the only place for my son. There aren't a lot of choices when your child's made some dreadful mistakes. They gave us as parents hope. Their commitment to Charlie was obvious. The buildings were dreadful and still are, but the warmth and the connectivity and the attention to Charlie and the feedback that we got from these amazing people, and they are amazing. You know, it's a really hard job. You go and spend a day in a PRU, it's a really hard job. You're trying, you've got a widespread mass of needs there, and finding the right path for each of those children with limited resources, you know, because Charlie had a lot of input from one teacher in particular who tried to get under his skin. But they worked with Charlie in a way that was right for him. And it's this individual planning and this individual care and attention, but more importantly, saying to Charlie and us that there was a route out of this, that there was a future. I'll be honest, you know, the future felt pretty dark, and they're like guiding you through this situation. Things weren't easy at home. He was very, very unhappy and very angry, and whatever we did didn't seem to help. And the one safe place I could take him every day was the bridge.
Yeah.
And they seemed to be moving forward with him, and very quickly, you know, after another hiccup, you know, he went back into another mainstream and made another mistake. So they managed to get him into a further education college. Before he was 15, actually, they took him on, and he got Student of the Year later. But the bridge came to his award ceremony, you know, and they are amazing people, really. And you say what makes a good teacher in a PRU. It's not particularly about qualifications. It's the character and the desire and the ability to build those relationships.
I think it's interesting. You said there about spending time inside a PRU or an AP academy and meeting the teachers. And I've spent time meeting teachers there and also talked to teachers in mainstream. And I've said to so many of them, go and spend some time at an AP school and understand the way that AP works. You mentioned you worked as a teacher in a school. Do you think that helped you to sort of understand and see what was different about an AP academy?
That's a difficult one, really, because I think mainstream have their own demands and problems, and again, most of it comes back to money. You know, if you've got endless funds, you can have small units, you can give more intense attention. But there's the constant morass of need, and it's only going to increase. You know, after this last year, I do fear for the future. I think we're going to have, you know, some major issues come to light in the next year. But that's just my belief. I'm hoping I'm wrong.
Thank you. I'm going to invite one of our APPG members to come in and ask some questions as well. Sally Ann Hart, are you there?
Thank you, Andy. I've got a few questions, so I don't know if you just want me to ask. I don't know how long I've got, but one of the ones I wanted to ask was, it appears that good or outstanding AP provision works better in smaller schools, and I wondered if when you're looking at the schools, so I think Say mentioned that 20 of the schools in Sheffield were unregistered, and presumably they're smaller. Is it a problem that alternative provision tends to be unregistered? I've had one alternative provision school provider. I had a meeting with them, gosh, before Christmas, and they were all registered. But one of the issues they raised was a lot of alternative provision is unregistered. And I wondered whether that does have an impact on the quality of the alternative provision, or whether it's based on size.
Say, would you like to come in and respond to that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So in Sheffield, there are around 20, currently around 24 providers. You're absolutely right that they tend to be quite small. And when I talk about quite small, I'm going to talk about a range from the smallest being 3 up to, there's 1 or 2 that are quite sizable, but generally speaking, let's say 3 to 20, and on my visits to each of those providers, typically I'm going to say an average of about 10, 11 students, etc., and quite sort of high staffing ratios. So they do tend to be small. They do tend to have a particular niche in terms of re-engagement through the arts, through sport, through animal care, etc., and really providing quite a different environment for those students to sort of re-engage and get back into their education.
Thank you. I don't know if Mark or Deborah want to come in on that point as well.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to, Andy, and then obviously pass to Deborah if she wants to add anything beyond. For me, it's about less about size and more about quality and connectivity, because I know some fantastic very small provisions, and Say's just talked of some who are doing amazing work, and it's really bespoke and personalised. And I know large provisions which may be quite separate and unconnected, and therefore may not be part of that continuum, or may not be benefiting from some of the CPD and the access and support and connectivity with other providers. So for me, it's about that, and I think it's about ensuring that the really high quality AP, which exists clearly within the sector, becomes more consistent. And I guess that's part of the premise behind the inquiry, really, in many respects. So for me, the smaller the setting, it's not so much about size, sorry, the less connected the setting, the harder it is to ensure consistent quality over time.
Thank you. Deborah, do you want to come in as well?
I think just adding to what everyone has said before me, that I think we're of the mind that actually all APs need to be registered, regardless of, you know, being a part-time provision, regardless of it being a really small provision. Yeah, it's important that all alternative provision is registered, and I guess that's way we're ensuring that quality is in place.
Thank you. Sally, did you want to come back with another question?
Yes, just looking at you know, the benchmarks for alternative provision, should they be the same as in traditional schools? And when you look at Ofsted, which is the school inspectorate, you know, should there be a completely different body looking at special educational needs and alternative provision? And should it be a separate body that looks at that?
Deborah, do you want to come in and answer that one first?
I guess we're of the mindset that it's very difficult in terms of the current benchmarks. And so when we have been inspected in the past, we've been inspected with the same lens as we would of other independent APs or other independent providers such as Eton.
Apples and pears.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been difficult to prove, I guess, our worth and the amazing work that we've been doing when we're being compared to such different standards. And so I think there is a sense that it's important to have maybe a different set of guidelines or benchmark to be able to kind of measure the impact and the work of some excellent alternative provision out there.
Thank you. Mark, did you want to respond on this?
Yes, thanks, Andy. For me, it's not, and the organisations I'm part of, it's not completely about the inspection framework. It's more about the implementation of it to a degree, because there is quite a lot of, it is quite complex, isn't it, the alternative provision sector, and it needs real specialist knowledge to be able to inspect and make those judgments around how you interpret the framework within the settings themselves. We're also very focused and interested in looking at outcomes more broadly, looking at the value gained by pupils in alternative provision, thinking about their personal development, obviously their academic performance, but also transitions and using those as indicators of measuring success. Because for some young people, an attendance that's rising from a very low baseline and rising quickly is a real success. And I'm glad that the framework does recognise that. But I'd like to see things broadened out and look at the real value of alternative provision, how it's working well.
Thank you. Say, you may want to respond. Then I'd like to bring another one of our APPG members in, if I can as well. Say anything to add to that?
Yeah. So I think lots of interesting points have been made. I think just putting some of those together. I think in terms of the all providers being registered, I think I understand that. I understand the need that would ensure quality. I think when you have 5 students for a couple of days a week, I think there's a question about the registration process and the capacity to actually do that. I think there's some excellent work that's been done by the Centre for Social Justice and Dennis Sims, who's on this call, about the benchmarking framework that's evolving. I do think with some of the small providers, though, I think, stopping someone self-harming is an outcome, and helping them to re-engage with school is an outcome, and that it presents a paradox there for how we do that. And the final thing I wanted to say is I agree with the notion that we have the Ofsted framework. I do think that perhaps there's a different area, different place for sort of AP and SEN and looking at that.
Thank you. I was going to bring in Edward Timpson, but his signal's not particularly good. So I will just say, and it's in the chat as well. Edward did a really excellent review some time ago now, and he does cover some of the issues around oversight and monitoring of schools, use of AP in that. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I think it's worth going back and taking a look into some of the things that Edward recommends. I think it's fascinating. Sally Ann, thank you very much for the question. It's really interesting to sort of hear very similar views on that from our panelists. I'm really keen to sort of just for a moment think about aims and purposes of different AP settings, and how, if there are lots of different models, are the aims and purposes of different AP settings different in themselves, or are they all the same? And considering that we're looking at what defines good and outstanding APs, is that something that's really sort of fundamental to getting it right? Mark, if I can come to you first.
Yes, thanks, Andy. So for me, I can simplify this and say, effectively, for me, the aims and purposes are largely the same, but the approaches vary significantly. Take you back to that model of personalised. In fact, obviously, it's been very strong from amongst the panel this morning, hasn't it, about the personalised offer and understanding the needs of the young people. Clearly, AP is quite a broad church. It covers a whole range of young people and their needs. And if I try and just think about that cohort and think about excluded young people, they will often, we'll see kind of challenges around externalising those behaviours, but obviously for those with medical needs, obviously in a range of settings, that might be more about internalising some of those behaviours. So it goes back to that model of being really personalised as an offer to meet the needs. And I think that takes us back to the previous question where we talked around interpretation of what's good quality, because I think you really have to understand those needs and the nuances of the approach to be able to make judgments around what is really good quality. But I think broadly the aims and purposes are very similar.
Thank you. Say, did you want to have anything on this?
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that, and absolutely the aims are uniform, but I think that it, again, coming from the Sheffield context, and I've talked a little bit about the small numbers and the very different approaches, the very personalised approach, and I think the thing to grapple with is that, and I'm not saying that unregistered provision is the way forward, but I'm saying that there's a lot of diversity that comes as a result of that, a lot of flexible, different approaches, which in a sense diversity is good. The challenge, the converse to that, is the consistency of approach and the quality of what that means. Where it's done well, it's absolutely stunning, but sometimes it's not always done well.
Thanks. Shirley, if I can come to you, I'm interested in your view as a parent on this one. In terms of sort of the purpose and the aims of the bridge when you went in there, do you think it was made clear, and did that really help in terms of the work that they were doing?
The aims of the bridge, I think they've got better at communicating what their aims are, but it's more an experiential thing. As I say, it's that lack of hope and that fear and the belief that these are the people that are going to lead you through this. And you're talking about regulation. I've been involved in Ofsted in mainstream. I've been involved in Ofsted at the bridge, which is quite difficult when you've got a small team with full-on things going on every day. I do think Ofsted has its place. And when you're talking about small suppliers, it's usually, I think I'm correct in saying, it's a larger organisation who are commissioning sort of woodland work or chefing or whatever in a small environment, just to try and get those kids to connect and find something they're good at to build their self-esteem with a member of staff usually. And it's, again, building that relationship. You can't get someone to improve their educational abilities until you've got that relationship. They're not going to engage with work. They're not going to want to improve their scores. You've got to build the relationship and get them to understand that there's something positive about engaging with normal education and possibly going back into mainstream. And that's such a delicate thing, often with very disengaged, often with other outside issues. This should be a safe place primarily, don't get me wrong. Wherever they are, they should always be safe. But I think a lot of smaller provision is commissioned, and surely whoever's commissioned it needs to go and inspect it and make sure that it's a safe and positive environment for the students they're responsible for.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not a very technical answer there. That's just as a parent. Obviously, we want our children to be safe.
I think that's the perspective of parents, I think, is really important. Deborah, if I can just turn to you about the sort of perspective of parents, for you and the work that you're doing, how important is it when you're doing the sort of the overview of aims and purposes, you're thinking about the parents as well?
Oh, it's absolutely important. I think, from the outset, it's really important to make sure that parents are involved in the process. At TLG, we, once the students refer to us, we immediately meet with the parents and the young person and just take them through the process, take them through what their experience in AP could look like and the possible outcomes for that young person. It's really important to get that initial buy-in and then, walk with them, talk with them throughout this journey, making sure that actually you're supporting that young person in the adequate way, but also the importance of supporting the parent. And I think Shirley alluded to this earlier on, that, once a young person is referred to AP, there is the stigma, there's the shame, there's that, oh my gosh, this is, such a big issue for me, what's going to happen to my young person? But reassuring the parent that it's okay. Actually, this could be the turning point in that child's education that could get them back on track, get them back into mainstream, and ultimately achieving the outcomes that they need for their educational journey. So parent engagement, absolutely key, really important to the AP journey for the young person.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Lord Story if I can. Lord Story, do you have some questions to ask? Oh, you've gone on to mute.
Back onto mute. Right. Well, first of all, thank you to all the panelists. You've really been superb in what you've said. My two thoughts and comments are the ingredients that you've suggested or say must be part of AP. It goes back to how do we ensure that those ingredients are actually happening in AP. And we know probably that registered provision is inspected by Ofsted, and I'm not sure that Ofsted have the workload always to be able to do the relationship inspection that's needed. And we also know that many of the providers are unregistered, and some are very, very good and some are very, very poor. So we do, and Shirley said it, we do need to have some sort of inspection regime for all providers, whether they're registered or unregistered. But the main question, which I want to put to all the panelists, is that the most important thing must be the quality of teacher. You know, how do you ensure that you get quality staff and quality leadership for that matter? And the couple of providers that I've visited have told me that it's very, very difficult to actually appoint the right staff for their provision. And I just wondered if you agreed with that and whether you had any thoughts about it.
Shirley, it might be nice to come to you first as a governor, because I'm sure in governors' meetings you'll have talked about recruitment and finding the right staff. What's your experience on this?
You did say Shirley, didn't you?
I did, yes. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, my experience as a governor now, take off the parent hat, put the governor hat on. The difficulty has been consistent funding and knowing what money we've got for the following year, and being able to plan long term. Always there's a baseline, and every year we've gone way over the baseline, which has two impacts. You cannot give permanent contracts. You cannot attract staff because they want to know that they can pay their mortgage as well as doing wonderful things. So that has its own issues. But I think the key thing is, just lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I'm not very professional, am I?
You're thinking about recruitment into
yes.
and the challenges of recruitment.
Yes, the challenges are obviously, ideally, you can plan ahead financially, so you can give permanent contracts. But I think it's key. The leadership know what sort of people will work within that environment and what's missing. You know, quite often in a small team, you've got a curriculum demand of needing science or needing this or needing that. But you've also got this very special type of person that can build relationships and can give hope. And they're really few and far between. I mean, I think the Bridge has done very well. The team is fabulous now, but it's taken many years. So I think more consistent knowledge of what's going on funding wise, being able to plan long term rather than constantly reactive. But the other downside to this is, for years, the Bridge has wanted to do intervention, working with local schools to intervene before those pupils are permanently excluded. And we never have the capacity because we're always miles over with all the emergency stuff, you know, come as it comes. And that's the bad thing, because I do think intervention is the way forward.
I'd like to come on to that in a second and talk more about intervention. Mark, can I come to you with regard to Lord Story's question there?
Thanks, Andy. I've got sort of two strands to my answer, really. The first one is drawing on the experience at Olive Academies. Obviously, we set up a multi-academy trust, and our first 3 academies we took on were all sponsored projects, which had all been in fairly deep, dark special measures in their sort of, you know, recent history when we were asked to come and take them on. And clearly at that point, it was a really interesting challenge to think about recruitment, where staff had felt quite dislocated and separate, and things hadn't been part of any continuum of offer. And goes back to my first answer around kind of professionalising the approach and making it attractive to the right type of staff who want to come and work and be part of that, what we describe as a mission and approach that, you know, come and join, and we want to be part of really meeting needs of young people and really go somewhere with what we're doing. And we've got an interesting curriculum model which tends to attract quite often the right type of teachers who are passionate about planning really nuanced, personalised learning, but connecting it out with the wider world. So we have an outdoor learning curriculum which helps to do that. And also drawing in, interesting, just looking at the chat around mainstream teachers. So we've got some, good partnerships with mainstream schools. We've got some secondments of staff, and be quite flexible. And you can do that in alternative provision. You can be probably more flexible than I was able to be as a mainstream head around some part-time contracts and sharing of staff. And that, once you get that kind of consensus and that momentum, it starts to attract other staff. I think the second part of my answer links to Shirley's really, which is around that's all well and good, and that's worked well for us at Olive Academies, but that consistency of funding and knowing where you are in terms of your decision making as a leader around not just the curriculum you offer, but how much you can keep moving your staff on in terms of ability, in terms of opportunities to develop their careers with, rather than they do really well with us and then they might want to move somewhere else. So I think that consistency of funding is really important to get the stability to be able to retain those staff and build them in terms of their own professional development as well.
Thank you. Deborah, did you want to come in on this? Deborah first.
Admittedly, it is hard to recruit within AP, but I love that notion that Mark brought around vocation and missional aspects, really wanting to kind of do this because you love that kind of work, you have that passion for that kind of work, and you want to bring hope and I guess a future to the young people that you're serving. And so it is sometimes a real kind of a thankless task, as it were, because it's messy and it's hard. And again, as Shirley said earlier on, it's sometimes it's not about having the specialized teacher, as it were, but someone that comes with life experience, lived experience, being able to really journey with that young person, being able to bring their experiences, being able to bring other specialisms to the table. So maybe social care, maybe health, and just bringing that sense of that package, as it were, to be able to bring that to AP can make a massive, massive difference. And I think, yes, it's about putting money behind it, because, making it more attractive, making it more progressive and bringing opportunities that people can sort of grow in their career within AP is really, really important. But it's a multifaceted, skilled, multi-experience vocation, and it does take a quite special person to do the job in AP.
I'd support everything that's already been said. I think the differences or additional points to make would be that for unregistered providers, they are small businesses, so that the funding is on a knife edge sometimes and can change from year to year and how many places they have. And again, that impacts on recruitment. Interestingly, in Sheffield, a lot of the providers do actually have qualified teacher status staff in there. I think from the point of view of inspecting unregistered providers, we don't know how many unregistered providers there are. As far as I'm aware, the DfE has made an estimate, but there's no number. So perhaps it's about providing some additional guidance and a bit more of a structured framework for the commissioning agencies to say these are the things that might be expected. And on the recruitment side of things, absolutely echo what everyone said. I'd also add one other thing, and that is in a separate project I'm working on. We're looking at the importance of subject-specific CPD in schools, and I think that's really pertinent in the AP sector as well, about this ongoing programme of really purposeful development, looking at all those additional arms beyond the traditional things in teaching and learning of pedagogy and assessment, etc. It's about some of those health and social needs, mental health, etc. Really specialised development of staff.
Thank you. If I can go to Jonathan Gullis MP, bring you in for some questions, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I've thoroughly enjoyed listening. It's one of those conversations where if you don't get early in with your questions, you miss out on all the ones you wanted to ask. So I suppose I'll just sort of say, Shirley, I think it's been brilliant to listen to your story. Must have been extremely challenging, and your honesty with that situation is refreshing. And I've really enjoyed sort of hearing, I think with recruitment, I personally believe that for any senior leader, whether they want to work in AP or not, they must have spent time in an alternative provision school, because ultimately they are the ones making decisions over kids. So if they're working in a mainstream school, I believe that I'd want to see the assistant principal or deputy principal in charge of safeguarding or behaviour has actually spent even just a 1 year secondment, if it were, in an alternative provision school, actually enacting change, looking at policy, working with these children. So therefore decision making is much more based from a knowledge of and lived experience, rather than just, you know, reading a pamphlet, which in the teaching I do get frustrated about. We can talk about ideology, theory, you know, academic sort of best practice, but actually reality is very different on the ground. There's been a real, I suppose, so that's just one sort of comment I personally believe. And I also think there should be incentivization as well for teachers to go and spend some time, whether that be through some sort of bonus scheme, you know, one-off bonus tax-free payment, whether that be, or tax incentives where you say people can have 1 or 2% off their income tax if they give maybe 1 or 2 years of service. But there's got to be something, because I wouldn't have been against working in alternative provision. I was, sorry, for the benefit of everyone listening, I was a school teacher for 8.5 years before entering this job. I was a head of year, so I've been to visit many PRUs in my time, and you know, had to move kids around the system, as it were. You know, one of the biggest issues I had was that we moved one kid from one school to another school, expecting that to magically change everything. That child initially fails their placement, they come back to our school, then we just start stage 2 of the process, which is looking for what's next. And I think there's some really important work, because I do think, and I'm going to be quite blunt about this, governments of all colours, whether that be red or blue, have failed in this area. I do think that we've not bothered to really properly ever invest in alternative provision or take it as seriously as we perhaps should have done. I think we've got carried away with, yes, what is the overwhelming majority of students in mainstream school, but these are the children who are at most risk and are therefore most vulnerable of falling into potential county lines in some cases, but also a lot of children who are SEND. And actually, and what really angers me is when I see the fact that there's 75% of people, adults in this country who have SEND are actually able to work. You know, they wouldn't have an issue, but only 5% from last figures I saw are in work because there's so many barriers, employers not having confidence, and those children not necessarily being fully equipped. And you know, and I think that's a real failing of the state, to be quite frank with you, and that's something we need to address. So I'm sorry, Chair, I will come now to questions after my rant, which won't surprise you. I suppose for me, the one question would be, there is certainly a move now by many schools to try and have alternative provision on their own school site. I would love to hear just how effective you think that is, if that is the way forward, or do we need these separate sort of institutions that maybe cover a range of schools? Should every multi-academy trust actually, and by the way, I believe multi-academy trust should be localized. I hate these big national ones that spread all over the place. But should multi-academy trusts actually have an alternative provision school within it? I mean, the one study I refer you to, you may have come across it, Solihull Academy. Now, I don't know how well that they've done, but I like the idea. They had 13 secondary school head teachers come around the table, all chip in to set up this alternative provision, which was going to have English, maths and science, but also work with local businesses, so kids will learn how to do personal training. They'll work with a local engineering company to do car maintenance and engineering. I just thought that was a real positive, where actually the schools were finally talking and working together. And then I'd love to also hear your views about regional schools commissioners. I have a real grind to axe that I just don't feel that they've ever had the powers that they should. And actually, I know as a teacher, I didn't know who the hell R1 was in the West Midlands. God knows how many parents know who their regional schools commissioner are. But what role can they play within alternative provision and helping children in this area? Because ultimately, I feel that they should be having a much bigger role and say within areas. And I just feel that whether that's they haven't got the powers, or whether that's they're just not interested, I'd love to hear your views.
Okay, two questions there to focus on. The structure of AP, should it be separate or part of a MAT, and the role of regional schools commissioners within AP. Say, if I can come to you first on that.
Yeah. So on the first point, with regards to the discussion about MATs creating their own. During the review that we carried out in Sheffield, we saw this starting to happen. Sheffield's got an interesting history with MATs, and we broadly speaking have 5 secondary MATs now, which are all relatively small. So I'm going to say less than 10 schools, but sort of five-ish schools. I think I think the setting up of that additional provision sometimes is a function of size. But one of the other things that we did really home in on during the review was geography matters. So the location of the appropriate provision from the school is essential. In one case, we found a very young student making a round trip of 24 miles per day to access the appropriate provision. So I think that the two things I'd say there would be that size and of the mat may be a function, but also how geographically dispersed that is. I'm aware of the Solihull Academy and again the model there, and I think that's a really interesting model. And I think, if I'm right, I think Kent did something similar as well. So I think that's that. On the RSC side, I would tend to agree with you, but on saying that, in Sheffield, we have engaged with the alternative provision part of the fee office and shared our review and met with them. So we are engaging with them and working with them.
Thank you, Say. Mark, can I come to you?
Thanks, Andy. Jonathan, you had two really good questions. In terms of the first question, in terms of the role of MATs within inclusion and supporting vulnerable young people, I think the answer really varies. My answer really depends on the kind of ethos and values of the mainstream MAT and the kind of intentions behind why they would want to set up a separate provision, if you like, as part of their continuum of offer. And often that can be for all the right reasons and can be really effective. I think we'd have to sort of drill down quite deeply and have a look at those young people and how long are they spending in that part of the MAT, and is there a clear pathway back into one of the mainstream academies or schools or not, as the case may be. And I think it comes back to something that I've known for the whole 30 years I've worked in education. Really, it comes down to, for me, thresholds of inclusion. In terms of as a former mainstream head, I'm very aware that I was a very, very inclusive head teacher, and I can think of young people that actually came down to the PRU that I was supporting and now in academies that I'm overseeing, who actually could easily thrive in a mainstream school setting. It is just about the decision making in an individual school sometimes. I've seen fantastic examples. I think Solihull was a good example. Olive Academies is supporting through the school improvement role at that academy, so we know it well. That's a lovely model, isn't it? And that can work really effectively. You've got high quality, experienced professional experts, if you like, leading the AP element, but working for and alongside the mainstream school leaders. So I think that is an interesting model. Olive Academies, we support a mainstream MAT that's incredibly inclusive, has the same values as us. They've taken on an AP academy that was inadequate, and we're supporting it. And I think that can work well. But I also think there's a real place for the high quality sort of specialist experts within that approach as well. And in terms of the RSC element, I mean, I operate, from Olive Academies within just one region deliberately, because I think that's absolutely right around that sort of local need and not trying to spread and not deliver high quality. And actually, Sue Baldwin and the team have been very supportive of the approach, and I can only be very positive about it, to be honest.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another question, if you don't mind, because we've got about 6 minutes left, and I want to cover one other area that we've not touched on yet, which is around working preventatively to avoid exclusions in mainstream schools. Because I think, when we're considering components of good quality AP, that sort of upstream working is really critical. Deborah, can I come to you first on this? How important is that in terms of good quality AP?
Yeah, I firmly believe that links between alternative provision and mainstream can prevent exclusion. And this is done by offering outreach support for pupils in mainstream who are experiencing difficulties. And so this may look like alternative provision staff going into schools to provide additional support for pupils and staff. For example, it could be extra input and specialist expertise to address maybe a young person's behavioural or learning needs. And I guess this kind of provision usually focuses on providing mainstream school staff with additional skills to manage the pupil behaviour and manage their learning needs. And that means then that mainstream school staff are then better equipped to handle early intervention themselves. And also these opportunities for AP and mainstream staff to share good practice can also lead to better support for students. And in addition, it adds a preventative focus, which means then that AP providers can offer support to a greater number of students because of the level of input required is then less.
Thank you. Shirley, can I come to you on that? Your experience as a parent in terms of AP in mainstream?
Not much experience of that, really. Charlie was just at the bridge. There was no sort of reaching out prior to that. There was an element when he went to a second school to be reintegrated, and that school were fabulous, and actually when Charlie reoffended would have kept him on, but me being a bag of a mother said he has to know this is when it stops, and he went back to the bridge. The Board of Governors would have kept him there because they felt their sixth formers had led him astray, 14, 15. But as far as my belief, not as a parent, because that didn't happen with Charlie, but my belief that intervention is key and working together, absolutely working together, because each side brings different skills. For example, any student who wants to do science in a small pupil referral unit often doesn't have a science lab. So if there's a kind of connection where there can be a little bit of crossover and support in different ways, that's what we've tried to do at the bridge. These simple practical things. Yeah. It's so important.
Yeah. So can I come to you briefly on that as well?
Yeah. Absolutely, and the upstream working is really important. I think the things I'd say here is about that early identification of need, but not just the identification, knowing that option of upstream work and working with an AP specialist is there, as opposed to we've identified a problem and we'll try and actually develop the solution. During the review, we did identify what we termed peripatetic AP, I have to say it right, in terms of AP workers going into a school setting and providing that support there, and then almost sitting with the student, helping them reintegrate, getting them back in, and then sort of stepping away. And I think that was a really interesting and simple model. And I think it's a really interesting concept to talk about that way of working.
Mark, just to conclude then, are your AP academies reaching into mainstream schools and working preventatively?
Absolutely, and completely agree with the panel's points. But really, the sort of final point, just to add to those comments, is around building capacity. I think really where upstream work, preventative work, outreach work, or any other way of describing it, where it's at its most effective, clearly it avoids the young person needing to be permanently excluded because their needs are being met. But that they'll only really be met in the long term if that capacity is and knowledge is built within the school. So that's the model we approach. So we support the schools to build that capacity so that a young person doesn't drop off very quickly afterwards because actually lessons haven't necessarily been learned. I think that's really important in terms of that continuum offer again.
Thank you. Jonathan Gullis wants to come back in very, very briefly.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, there we go. Thank you, Chair. The school building, I think, is a massively underutilised asset in a community. And I was wondering what role you thought outside youth agencies, I'm very lucky to have YMCA North Staffordshire in my area, could play in helping with, like you say, the AP sector coming into mainstream schools in order to avoid, where possible, children having to be excluded.
I think that's a really interesting question, sort of leads us into other areas. Perhaps I can just ask Mark to come back on that very, very briefly, because we're literally almost out of time.
Yeah, just very briefly, it's about connectivity. So absolutely, it's about using services, as you just described, Jonathan, to build the capacity and the knowledge base to support young people. And I think the more we can get to a place where wraparound support and care is defined and is in place, less chance we've got of young people falling from provision, and the more likely they're going to be feeling success and moving on in terms of their own educational journey.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to bring it to a close. I think actually we probably could have had another half an hour to an hour on talking about the elements that make good quality alternative provision. But I think the very clear message that we're hearing today is sort of the inclusive nature of AP, of bringing parents in, of bringing students in, of bringing mainstream in, because that's actually how you engage on a broad basis and help children make the step back into mainstream if that's the right route for them to move forward. But so many interesting elements covered today. I want to thank our panelists, Mark Vickers, Deborah Barnett, Shirley and Say Patel. Fascinating insight from all of them. Can I thank our APPG members as well for their input into this session. And of course, we are keen to hear from other people in terms of your submissions to our inquiry into what the components are of good quality alternative provision. Please do write to us. You can write to me. You can email me, andy.carter.mp@parliament.uk, and I will ensure that your submission goes into the inquiry submission. Or of course, you can also contact the Centre for Social Justice, who are our secretariat. And I want to finally say a big thank you to them for organising this APPG as well, in particular to Alice and the team, who've done a fantastic job of putting together 4 really excellent speakers. Thank you very much indeed. We will be in touch in the coming weeks with some thoughts on this session and also with details of our next inquiry. And our next evidence session. But for now, thank you very much for joining us, and I do hope you found this interesting.
Thank you, Andy.